This is TWiT.
It's Whiskey Day.
Yeah, it's Whiskey Day every day.
Every day is Whiskey Day.
Every day is Whiskey Day.
It's also just past, it's the day after Canada Day. So, of course, I have to talk about a Canadian whiskey. And
You mean there's something beside Crown Royal out there?
and there, and Crown's awesome. And, I've done, 2 or 3 different Crowns. So I've given
There you
Crown a
go.
lot of love. And I have talked about this week's distiller before, Alberta Distillers. I just never talked deeply about the distillery. But this particular whiskey, I do not have a bottle here. It was at the Canada celebrations I was at. They were doing a tasting, so I had a taste of it and immediately wrote it up. This is Alberta Distillers 23-year-old rare batch number 1. And what's rare about it? Well, for starters, it's a 23-year-old whiskey from Canada. That's weird. And it was pretty darn tasty. It was also 100% rye, which is odd.
I thought all Canadian whiskey was rye whiskey.
Well, they're often called rye whiskeys, but they're not all rye. So let's get into that. But first, talk a little bit about Alberta Distillers. They're not one of the nouveau distilleries. They've been around since 1946. They're founded in Calgary. 3 partners: Max Bell, who is a rancher. Okay, Alberta, that makes sense. Frank McMahon, who is an oil man. Oh yeah, okay, Alberta. Yeah, that makes sense too. Yeah. And George Rifle, who was the distiller and a very skilled distiller. He'd worked in Japan. He'd worked in Scotland. He was making beer and his own spirits, and they recruited him in the founding of the company. Back in 46, when they built it on 23 acres at the edge of the city of Calgary. Today, that's now kind of the middle of Calgary. They expanded to 42 acres in 1975. They picked that location because A, they were all Albertans, so they wanted to be in Alberta, and B, it was right on 2 separate rail lines. So all of their materials come in by rail because, of course, they're inland. They're also at altitude. That's the east side of the Rockies there. So they're at about 1,000 meters or 3,200 feet or so, which this is not Denver by any stretch of the imagination, but it's high enough that it does impact the environment that the whiskey's going to mature in. And so they build temperature-controlled warehouses because the wintertime in Calgary can get extremely cold, -40. It does occur in a place like Calgary. They get nice summers. Famously, in wintertime, there's these winds they call the Chinooks, which are a warm wind on an icy cold day. So their warehouses are massive, 600,000 barrels.
You are a warm wind
on an icy cold day.
An icy cold day. And they do both rack and pallet style. This is not a place for a tour, Alberta Distillers. This is very much a factory. And they've gone through the normal things that happen to whiskey companies over the years. They were acquired by American Brands in 86. Of course, American Brands became Fortune Brands in 97. And then in 2011, the entities were reshuffled again. And that's when Beam acquired all of the spirit products. And then Beam itself, that's Jim Beam out of Kentucky. That was then acquired by Suntory in 2014 to make Beam Suntory. And then recently, in 2024, that was renamed to Suntory Global Spirits. So that's the company. And column stills and pot stills. So their main products are a line of vodkas like Banff Ice and Northern Keep and Alberta Pure, typical names for vodkas. And then whiskeys, Alberta Premium, Alberta Springs, and Rifle Rye after the distiller, Mr. Rifle. They also make whiskey for a lot of other companies, many you've heard of, like Canadian Club, Masterson's Rye, Jefferson's Rye, and Whistle Pig. I also think that Pendleton Rye, which we've talked about here before, came from them.
They make Whistle Pig?
And they make Whistle Pig.
Huh.
And that's known. Like they admit that this big facility that produces an awful lot of whiskey. And remember, the whiskey travels, it used to at least, travel easily back and forth across the border. Right now, nothing travels across the border particularly well. And I also mentioned another Canadian whiskey called Bareface. And when I looked at the description of how Bareface, that was the one with the big slashes in the bottle.
Yeah, I remember that one. Yeah.
And I remember when I was looking at how they were making the whiskey, because they're in British Columbia. Now you come out of nowhere with a 7-year-old plus whiskey. It's that I was pretty sure they're buying from Alberta Distillers a 7-year-old whiskey. And then they're doing a finishing step. They split it into like wine casks and Hungarian oak casks and age it for a year in the British Columbia wilderness. All very cool, but that's where it comes from. Because Canadian distillers, not just Alberta distillers, but several of them, do this thing that's different from the way Americans make whiskey, which is that they don't do mash bills. They don't combine different grains into a mash to produce the wort that will become the whiskey. They actually keep them separate. And Alberta Distillers specifically is famous for making true 100% rye. Now, why is that weird? And it's because rye is a very difficult grain to work with. The reason is that it has two things that are very important about the grain rye when it comes to whiskey making. One is that it's mostly composed of complex polysaccharides, which really is a way to say they're even longer chain carbohydrate sugars that are very difficult to break down into sugar that can be digested by yeast. And those long chains tend to make very thick mashes that stick to the equipment and don't flow through pipes well and create lots of foam. And so it's hard to make a bunch of it. When you're doing a fermentation, if you ever get a chance to go on a distillery tour where a ferment is running, you'll notice that the mash tun literally looks like it's boiling. It's not warm enough. It's only about 30 degrees centigrade in there. But there's enough carbon dioxide being produced that it's constantly turning over. Well, the rye mashes are so thick that instead of having this steady turnover that keeps the temperature even so the yeast stay healthy, it's so dense it heats up in the center and kills off the yeast because it can't move around. And so they have to use stirring equipment to keep the mash evenly mixed and keep the temperatures even so the yeast stay healthy, but it sticks to the stirring equipment, which damages the equipment. Like, it's really difficult to work with. And this is the other aspect of rye, besides the polysaccharides, is that it doesn't have a hull. And normally, whenever you make a grist, you combine a certain amount of fine ground flour with a medium grind and some hull. And the hull is mostly about creating spacing to keep the mash a little more fluid so it's easier to move around. And so the result is you just can't use as much rye mash per batch, which means you produce less alcohol, which means it's just a more expensive product to make. It's also a more expensive grain. I looked up today what the price per ton was for commercial grains. The cheapest is corn at about $165 a ton. Barley's number 2 at $170. Of course, these prices change. Wheat's at $195. Rye's at $220. So rye is more expensive. You can't use as much of it per batch. It's hard on your equipment. It's just, why would you do this to yourself when you can combine it with a few other grains and make your life easier and make a good product still? So 100% grain ryes are just weird. I also read a great piece about how prohibition devastated rye making, that the rye whiskey makers, the few companies that were good at making rye, most of them went bankrupt through the prohibition period. And so when people started back up, there wasn't a lot of people who knew how to make rye, and nobody cared. They were just in a rush to make whiskey quickly. And so that's when corn really emerged huge as the approach to whiskey for most places, and rye never caught on again. Now, Alberta Distillers, again, is famous for making 100% rye because they came up with a reliable process for it. So they don't malt their rye, which is something you can do. You soak it in water, let it sprout, and then dry it to help break down the sugars. And that used to be an older approach, but they don't do that at all. They only make a fine flour. So they don't do a mixed grist. They use a hammer mill, grind unmalted rye down to a fine flour. Then they add water and a custom-made proprietary enzyme called glucoamylase. So Alberta Distillers employs a microbiologist. Her name is Dr. Shannon Thomas, and she has matured this unique enzyme that's primarily glucoamylase, but also has a bunch of what they call side enzymes that work together to help break the rye down into sugars that the yeast can digest, and also introduce the set of flavors that people like from rye that tends to be a little spicier, a little more interesting. And then that successful digestion, so you don't make any methanol, you're just producing ethanol, can then be pushed as a wort into stills. And in Alberta Distillers uses both column stills and pot stills. You knew that because they make vodka. You need column stills to make vodka. And then pot stills. So they do this mixed combination where they make a more high distillate and a mid distillate. They do a little finishing in the pot stills, and then they split up the aging batch too. They use a bunch of ex-bourbon barrels. They will also reuse bourbon barrels after they've run through because they have a different flavor profile, and also new white oak out of Missouri, American oak. They're also not afraid to go in at fairly high alcohol levels. So traditionally, new bourbon goes into new American oak barrels at 62.5. And then the Scots and most everyone else, when they're reusing bourbon barrels, will go in at 63.5 because they can pick off a few other flavors. Under certain conditions, Alberta Springs will go as high as 78 going into the barrel. But because they're high and dry in places like in Alberta, they actually lose water faster than they use alcohol. So their barrels are known for increasing alcohol levels rather than decreasing alcohol levels. And it's atypical because of a low humidity, relatively warm environment at certain times of the year. In the cooler times, it can go the other way. They can lose alcohol. But this is the same problem Kentucky battles with. Although I would point out they have actually bottled an 84%, 168 proof, which apparently was a hit at the time when they made it. So in some ways it's more Kentucky-ish because it does deal with that high and dry environment. They are willing to go to different alcohol levels. They're doing different kinds of extraction in the barrel. They also tend to go shorter term. Most Canadian whiskeys are not aged more than 3 or 5 years, maybe 7. Right? There's literally a standard commercial product that Alberta Distillers makes for other people, including folks like Barefaced, that's a 7-year-old. And then you do other things with it. Except for this old rare batch. This old rare batch was barreled in 2000. It's been sitting ever since, and they did a bottling in 2023, which is why it's a 23-year-old. And it is one of the most unusual whiskeys you'll ever taste because it's a very old, pure rye whiskey. It's bottled at 50% ABV, and it is only sold in Canada at about $150 a bottle.
And so we can't get it here in the States. Thanks a lot, Richard.
You have to come for a visit. Like, there's no
stupid Canada.
No way. They're not
Actually,
the only
I
ones. There's
suspect
a lot of
this
Canadian
is
whiskeys.
a problem with a lot of Canadian whiskeys nowadays,
Yeah,
right?
it's true.
Yeah.
You have to get to a certain production level before it makes sense to ship south anyway, just from the cost perspective.
Well, and you have removed all American whiskeys from your shelves. So
at the moment, yes. Hopefully one of these days that will pass.
This is a trade war.
And a foolish one at that.
Benefits no one, especially whiskey drinkers.
Pretty sure it's hurting everybody right now.
Every once in a while, a bird flies through the web page.
Yeah, I was just noticing that. It looks
really
like,
cool.
It's like the opening screen of a video game.
Yeah, it's great.
You know,
it's not all the time. It's just,
is that the Half-Life 3 home screen?
They don't have a page for this old batch one.
I was
they only
looking.
talk about their retail products. Yeah. And I looked around. The only ones I found are actually on reseller sites. But it's like I said, it's a relatively rare whiskey. But they are. I can get them. There's none on the coast, or I would have gone and grabbed a bottle. There's a couple in the city, which I won't get to for another week.
When I was in Toronto, I used to have to go to a special state-run store to buy liquor. Is that true?
The LCBO.
The CBOs everywhere?
Every province does it slightly differently. Okay. For a long time, BC was like that as well, but we've started having third-party licenses for some spirits.
Okay.
So my favorite whiskey store in Vancouver when I go is a place called the Legacy Liquor Store.
It's such an artifact of an earlier age.
Totally.
It's like the blue laws in New England, where like you can't buy fish on Tuesday. It's like
unless you live near the New Hampshire border, then it's okay.
Thank you, Richard Campbell. As always, you make Windows Weekly fun, at least a little drunker. Anyway, at least that.